AI is a powerful tool.
This summit can help ensure that artificial intelligence charts a course that benefits humanity and bolsters our shared values.
Welcome to AI for Good, the leading action-oriented, global and inclusive United Nations platform on AI. Organized by ITU, in partnership with 40 UN sister organizations, and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of AI for Good is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and scale those solutions for global impact. In today's session, we're counting on you to use the live video wall feature to ask questions and post comments to help create an engaging discussion. We encourage you to stay until the end to chat, connect, ask questions, and network with our distinguished panelists and world-class AI experts in the neural network. It is now time to kick off the session and welcome our first speaker. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. A very warm welcome to AI for Good, a webinar series by the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU. My name is Jennifer Woodard. I'm an AI entrepreneur and co-founder of Insight AI, a machine learning startup focusing on the detection and defeat of online harms. So we're very happy to have you all here for what I know is going to be an exciting discussion about a topic that's on everybody's mind today, and that is ChatGPT. ChatGPT has moved AI and specifically large language models to mainstream consumption, creating a lot of speculation about its possibilities, but also some trepidation about what widespread adoption of technology like this might mean for us as a society. And today we're here to speak specifically about how ChatGPT can enable the future of education, as well as the challenges and opportunities we might face on this new frontier. And to discuss this fascinating topic today, we're bringing together students and educators to weigh in on the impact of ChatGPT and large language models in their daily lives. So I'd like to get started by introducing our panelists for today. Today, we're joined by Professor Philip Hacker. He holds the chair for Law and Ethics of the Digital Society at the European New School of Digital Studies at European University Viadrina, Frankfurt. Prior to joining ENS, he served as an AXA postdoctoral fellow at the Faculty of Law at Humboldt University in Berlin. He's a Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute and an ASK Fellow at the WZB Berlin Social Science Center. His research focuses on the intersection of law and technology, and in particular, he analyzes the impact of tracking technologies, AI, the IoT on consumer and privacy and discrimination law. He also cooperates with computer scientists and mathematicians, specifically on questions of explainable AI and algorithmic fairness. Welcome, Professor Hacker. We also have Professor Sandra Wachter. She's a professor of technology and regulation at the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford, where she researches the legal and ethical implications of AI, big data, and robotics, as well as internet and platform regulation. Her current research focuses on profiling, inferential analytics, explainable AI, algorithmic bias, diversity, fairness, as well as government surveillance, predictive policing, and human rights. So thank you for joining us today, Professor Wachter. Welcome to AI for Good. And then we have our students. Welcome, everyone. I'd like each of you to introduce yourselves. Maybe we can start with you, Jason. Could you just give us an introduction?
Hi. Yes, I'm Jason. I'm a grade 11 student at United World College, Southeast Asia, East Campus. I've long been interested in artificial intelligence. I remember back in December, I was telling all of my friends about GPT-3 before ChatGPT had come out in 2021. I recently working on artificial intelligence, global governance and policy. I co-authored a recent UNDRR report on artificial intelligence and the risks from emerging technologies. And yes, I'm a profound advocate in my school about how AI can be used to enhance our learning.
Great. Thank you, Jason. Julia, could you please introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Julia Messam, and I'm a first-year student at the European New School for Digital Studies, pursuing my master's degree in digital entrepreneurship. Prior to that, I worked in various roles throughout the legal and banking industry. I think I bring a unique perspective because at one point I was a digital innovator at a law firm that worked in the banking industry. They still used a typewriter every single day. So it was my job to help digitalize things and help them figure out how to automate tasks.
Excellent, Julia. Happy to have you here. You do bring a very unique perspective. I'm going to really enjoy talking to you today. Okay, Faisal, could you introduce yourself?
Okay, my name is Faisal Khwele, and I'm also a colleague of Julia at the European New School, studying a Master's of Digital Entrepreneurship, as well as a student of Philip Hackers. I come from Jordan, where I worked a bunch of years in humanitarian and development agencies, such as the Norwegian Refugee Council and the International Rescue Committee. But right now, I'm focusing more on studying digital entrepreneurship and technology. I am also a research assistant at our chair of sociology of technology, and I tend to focus a lot in my studies about platforms, ethics of AI, and the politics of technology.
Excellent. Welcome. And finally, we have Moiteri. Could you please introduce yourself as well?
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Moiteri Hanisi. I am from Lesotho. I'm an IB student, International Baccalaureate student here at Machapen College in Lesotho. So I'm a Generation Connect Youth Envoy. It stems from the ITU, which is the International Telecommunications Union. I would say that I am a tech enthusiast. I've always been very much interested in artificial intelligence and its potential and how much it could just change the world. Yeah, it's very exciting to be here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for joining us. Okay, to kick off, obviously, we have a lot of topics to discuss, and I'm very anxious to get the perspective from both sides, both educators and students. I wanted to ask first the professors. You obviously have a background in AI, you study things related to large language models. What was your first impression, or what's the first thing that came to mind when you heard about ChatGPT coming on the scene kind of for mainstream consumption?
Sandra,
go ahead.
You go first.
Yes, go ahead, whoever.
Well, I can say that when I first heard about it, I guess my first thought was kind of in a bit humorous way. Well, that's great. Students are going to be writing stuff with the help of AI. We're going to be grading it with AI. And in the meantime, everybody is, going for fishing and climbing. Then when I sobered up a little bit, it turned out that obviously there are so many problems related to text production and grading and everything with the help of AI that I started to see it as a challenge, a blessing, but also a curse in some areas. And I think we're here to tease out where it can be what. And I don't want to go too deep in it, just saying that we're starting to use it. I've just received the first batch of essays. It's on my table, on my computer, of essays written with ChatGPT. And I've looked into some of them. Some are awesome, some are less.
Okay, great. Professor Proctor?
Yes, I had a similar reaction that when I first saw it, I also thought, students are going to use it for essay writing, and I can finally use it for grading, which is my least favorite activity in my job. So it's a win-win situation. But obviously, like Philip already said, there are issues here with delegating that responsibility to somebody else from both sides, students as well as educators. But I think we're going to talk about the negative things, I think in just a second in more detail, but I think it's also just a really, really good opportunity to reflect on what kind of educational and pedagogical strategies are actually fruitful and helpful, and how we communicate knowledge, how people take on that knowledge, and how we can make assessments of whether they actually understood what's going on, if they're actually are able to reflect on that, right? And so that maybe moves us away from traditional modes of assessing people's abilities, right? And maybe that gives us the opportunity to think about new ways of teaching and learning together.
Excellent. And on the student side, what were your initial impressions when you heard about this technology? Can I start with you, Julia?
Yes, I wasn't totally surprised because I'd been using something similar, a reverse dictionary, to teach my own students. One of my side jobs in the US was being an English tutor. And so I used the reverse dictionary to help generate new words for them if they were confused, to help teach them that strategy. But I was really surprised by how good ChatGPT was at generating a lot of different types of content. So while I think it'll be very useful, I'm also hesitant. I think the way it hallucinates is concerning.
Yeah, that's come up a lot. Jason?
Sure. I, like Julia, have been using something similar. When OpenAI released GPT-3, I was first on the wait list and wanted to try and see very early on, back before like this ChatGPT was layered on top of it, how I could use it in my education. I remember just how tremendously bad it was. Not only the models that were existing to the public that were available back then, but just how unusable, and how it really took a lot of skill and time to get the output that you wanted. And when ChatGPT came on the scene, there were a couple of days after OpenAI first released it that it hadn't blown up yet. And in those days when I was playing with it, I had this distinct feeling that this was just much easier to use. And I suspect that was the sort of shift that was going to cause this explosion of growth that we are seeing. And now I like walk into class and it's commonplace to discuss the impact of these large language models on our education. Even the people who were initially slow to transition have at least thought about it. And even though they have, as everyone has mentioned, expressed their hesitancies, I think everyone is realizing that change is about to happen.
Right. That the jumping off point of actually putting large language models in front of a larger consumer audience with this kind of easy to use layer is actually really taking it to the next level.
Right.
Okay. Faisal?
Yeah, I think the biggest concern, like the previous period, it was basically the Wild West, because it has just come out, everyone's starting using it. Schools were banning it on one side, you had other schools adopting it on the other. If you were to use it, how were you supposed to use it? What were the limitations? Where do you go? Where do you stop? How do you cite it? So it was like, and also everyone's being impressed with it, but as soon as you get your hands on it and the more you use it, you start understanding that it's not all that in all the different ways that it can be. So it was just, and still is to an extent, more or less a bit of a Wild West.
I agree. Moiteri?
My first impressions of this was I was actually in awe. I had never seen anything like that ever in my entire life. I had actually encountered it before everyone else at school, and I had not known that I had. I just saw this interesting technology that I just decided to try online, and didn't know that it would boom so much to be known all over the world. And how it handled, I'm in school, so how it handled our schoolwork and how it did everything was just incredible. I thought it was wonderful, honestly.
Great. So in terms of the uses, I mean, right now, Faisal, you were talking about it's maybe not so great for some things and better for other things. And maybe there's actually been a lot of hype, not just in the education space, but all around of, how powerful these tools are. What are some of the areas where you do believe that it is beneficial to you in terms of education? Would anyone like to get into that one? Maybe Jason?
Right. So I think it has only become increasingly useful over time. And though we are here to discuss ChatGPT, like I think the technologies that are built on top of it have been actually the place where I've seen the most impact in my education. So I'm also in the International Baccalaureate, and part of this, we have a lot of assignments, and the IB recently came out with a statement saying they approve the use of these large language models in assisting with our internal research. And like, given this license, I've started to experiment with the number of possibilities that these models can offer for assisting and pushing forward some of the research that I was doing. The way that I currently treat it is it's in some sense a search engine that understands what I want much better, much quicker, much more accurately, and pointing me to the right places much faster. And this is a huge boon for how I can do my research and how I can look at individual topics. I think the example that struck out to me was there are different steps in the knowledge producing process, right? And in the past, with the advent of Google and Wikipedia and say calculators even before that, we see that a lot of the later parts of this process we could offload to some technologies, right? So we're thinking research, we can get accurate information very quickly. And I think the great revolution that these large language models have been for me is just taking this very first step, this ideation, and that being a place where I can sort of augment myself and augment the ideas that I have someone to like have a conversation with about what I'm trying to develop, and putting some of my loosely formed ideas into concrete words and trying to get a first draft or get a first pass of a brainstorm of ideas to approach a topic before I begin outright. Yes.
That's interesting. So you're basically doing kind of a sandboxing exercise, but instead of having this very kind of unilateral interaction with the information, you're actually benefiting from this kind of one-to-one, as it were, conversation that you're having with the AI. That's really interesting. Thank you for that. Go ahead, continue.
Yeah, right. And it's interesting, like the previous alternatives that would have existed to this, right? Before, if I wanted to have something similar, I would have had to sit down with my teacher or go with a friend who was like extremely, who knew the topic, and we would have to arrange a time, we would chat, and they don't necessarily have access to the whole internet. And to have this at my fingertips whenever I want it, wherever I want it, is an extreme boon for how I do this first part of the research stage. It's just made me a lot quicker, and I think a lot more productive and efficient in how I've done a lot of these tasks.
That's fascinating. Professor Hucker, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I can just reinforce that from an experiment kind of that we did in one of my classes. And I believe maybe Julia, you were present. I can't quite remember. But so what we did basically is I told students, well, imagine you have to write an essay on a kind of complex topic, the legal implications of quantum computing, which is, technically difficult, and it's also not necessarily obvious what the legal implications would be. And so we used ChatGPT kind of in a guided way, and I gave them 45 minutes to exactly do this ideation thing, and start with an outline, then refine your prompts, and then go step by step, intro, and then the different parts. And it was just surprising. I was kind of mind blown to see what the output was. It wasn't perfect, but it was a good first sketch. And to me, this brings out two important points. And one is about inclusion, because Jason rightly said that, it's great to experiment with it. But from as much as I can tell right now, Jason is a very outspoken student. But we have a lot of students who are less outspoken, or maybe even researchers who have horror of the blank page. I know a couple of people. And for them, it's just such a relief to get started. Or think people with dyslexia, really lots of people suffering a lot writing a single email. And for them, this is a dream come true, with all the strings attached. But I'm just saying this can be a tool for inclusion for people also with special needs. And on the other hand, I want to pick up on what Sandra said. I think this is really important, not only for teachers, but also for students to engage in this conversation of what kind of teaching, what kind of education do we want to have? And I see this a lot because our students, like Julia, like Faisal, they come from all over the world, same in Oxford, of course, same in many other institutions, with very different backgrounds from their bachelors sometimes of what it means to have an education. And what I try to teach them, we try to teach them at ENS and Oxford, same, is to get thinking on their own. If they want a good grade, you have to think for yourself. And this critical interaction with something rather than reproducing something, this can also be facilitated, I think, via ChatGPT and other tools, because you get a draft and then your task is not to write something up or so, it's to critically interact with something, to fact check it, to improve upon it, and to bring in and to form it in your own guise, let's say. And then from there, we can even talk about research collaborations, because, what I get essays now, they look almost publishable. So we can team up, or I can advise them, and we can even go for a research step at a very early process. I think those are really important and interesting perspectives that would not have been so easily in place before.
Very interesting perspective there. So just to continue this, I'd like to continue maybe with Faisal. Maybe you can tell me a little bit more about how you've been using it, how you're seeing other people around you use it, what you believe it's good or bad for.
Yeah, so it's basically more or less as Jason and Philip said. So there's a saying that like 90% of writing is procrastination. And there's this thing, like when you want to write about a particular topic and you want to talk about it, you might have read all the books and all of the literature. So you sit down, and as Philip said, you have the blank page and you zoom out, which is basically what's called analysis paralysis. You just keep thinking of over and over of the things that you want to put down on the paper, but you can never actually start. So there are certain exercises you can do, but I think ChatGPT just helps you with that. Sometimes grabbing the tip of the thread to be able to produce like a coherent thought, more or less. You can just ask it whatever kind of question, even if the prompt that comes out is 100% opposite what you want, but at least like it got you thinking that, okay, this is not what I want. What I want is this, so you start writing it. Or if it just starts gathering ideas, some things you want, some things you don't want. So in a sense, it just gives you multiple points that you can connect, or at least it gives you the tip of the thread that you can start pulling. But in a sense, I also mentioned the possibly bad parts about it, because it might give you all of these prompts. And if you're none the wiser to realize that not all of this is valid, not all of this should go in what I want to do, and you just more or less blindly trust it, that's where one of the biggest pitfalls, because you need still to do your due diligence to be able to validate everything that it gives you. To the same sense that if you Google something, or if you look at academic papers, and you don't just take all the information that you get blindly, you need to validate them, you need to make sure that they're reliable. And the same thing with ChatGPT.
Excellent. Anyone else want to chime in kind of on how you're using it, what you believe it to be good for or not so good for?
I agree that with everyone that it's a great starting point. It can really create a really comprehensive outline, but I completely agree with Faisal. It still gives sometimes very incorrect information. So it is a student's job to do their due diligence, but we still shouldn't necessarily have students just rely on using ChatGPT to generate ideas. I still think there's a lot of value in reading text and evaluating everything, especially in the legal field. That's usually how we do start to address different issues that we're unfamiliar with. We just start to do the research. And there are going to be things that ChatGPT just doesn't generate. So we can't completely replace the traditional method with this new method.
Right, I totally agree. I was just thinking that I come from a time kind of when you had to, find library books on the shelf and dig into them. And actually even finding the library books was hard with the Dewey Decimal System, like these types of very old school things. And I wonder if in this digging and having this kind of making the effort for looking for the information is actually part of the like a beneficial part of the process. And if we're actually losing something in the lack of this type of exploration when everything's kind of already set out there for you. Obviously what you're saying, Faisal, that the prompts, yeah, you have to kind of know how to write them and to find what you're looking for in that way. But a lot of the friction in terms of how you access information has been removed. I don't know if anybody has an opinion on that. Sandra, did you have your hand up?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
I think you're pointing at a really, really important question, which is just, the first order question of like, what purpose should we be using this tool? We should not be using it to spend less time on research, and we should not use it as a shortcut, and we should not use it to cut corners. That's the thing that it's really not good at, and that's not something it should be used at. And it's not just about finding the right facts. It's also about critically engaging with those facts. So again, I'm a lawyer. I teach technology and regulation. And my mantra in my class that I say every time when I open a class is just because something is published doesn't mean it's right. So that means that whatever you see, whatever you read, just because it's out there, it doesn't mean you have to believe it, even if everybody else believes it. And so that's just something that ChatGPT can never take over, critically thinking about whether we believe that an idea, an experiment, a methodology, a theory is correct. That is something that we cannot and should not delegate. That's the most fun part of the job, is trying to think about whether this actually convinces me, or whether this is something that I completely disagree with, and why I disagree with it, and what I think should be done instead. Like that type of engagement, I think we cannot and should not ever delegate, right? And so it is probably good for like just giving you a rough draft, but then engaging in, first of all, fact finding, because, it could be simple things like, is this judgment actually from 2018 or not? You still need to double check, right? You cannot trust the technology because, it can be very convincing telling you that happened in 2018 when it was actually 2022. So you still need to do due diligence to find out if the facts are correct. And whether or not you believe in the judgment, whether the judge was actually correct, is something that ChatGPT can never take off your plate, nor should it be, right? And so I think, if anything, that's what I want to see that tool used is as actually a re-invitation to be more vigorous with research, because when something is published, we tend to think that it's probably accurate because it went for peer review and got published and things like that.
Right.
But with ChatGPT, we're like, no, I actually need to double check that. And you should do this with every paper that you read as well, but we kind of like not always do that, right? Not everybody has the time to do so, but with ChatGPT, maybe we can come back to that good tradition of actually re-evaluating and rethinking and re-questioning everything that we actually are reading. So if we use that tool for that purpose, I think it could actually stimulate a much richer intellectual community and discussion.
Jason, I saw you shaking your head. Do you have an opinion on this?
Maybe I would be a little bit more optimistic in terms of what ChatGPT can do for our critical thinking skills. So the one example that comes to mind is, I think, like adding on to your point, Sandra, I think you can really augment the way that you critically think with these tools. So the one example that comes to mind is I was in a biology class, and part of this class was engaging with papers at least in the science field, like famously, there's a ton of prerequisites that are required for understanding and digesting these papers. And I was talking with the teacher, and we took a paper and we put one of the figures and the figure explanations into ChatGPT and asked them to explain it. And I think it did a good job, so much so that he said, like, he was pursuing a doctoral thesis at that time. He said that this was the type of work that he spent the first 2 years of his PhD doing, that he could have condensed into, say, 3 months. But the lesson that I got from me is, I think, as someone who was like only in high school and having not engaged like for many years with the field, what it allowed me to do is take this really jargon-filled like explanation and add this like simple layer on top of it, such that I could critically think about it, right? It was an enabler so that I could understand and engage with the actual material, because before, and this just opened up a huge variety of tasks and different fields that I could do this with. And obviously there are caveats, right? There are like the simplification is an additional burden, right? It takes expertise and many years to be able to tell what is missing. But I think I recognize the necessity for that expertise. But like in this specific example I was talking about, like my teacher was an expert, and he was like, this is this is pretty amazing in how it's able to take the most important points here and explain this in a really digestible way. And so the thing I would come back on and say is like, yes, now that this is in a more digestible form, I can engage with this critically when I previously wouldn't have been able to.
Because you would not have been able to engage with it because you lack the domain expertise to actually get into the content. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Faisal.
Yeah. So if we were to talk about factual things, especially engaging with any kind of language model or ChatGPT or GPT-4, and we can probably reach a consensus. Did this event happen in 2018 or 2020? Then this is wrong, this is right. But when it comes to more nuanced topics that aren't exactly right or wrong, that's where things get a little bit muddled. I don't know if this is too early in the conversation to talk about politics, but when ChatGPT, there was a research center and they did multiple political leanings tests to ChatGPT. And almost all of them found out that ChatGPT was always left-leaning and a little bit libertarian. And GPT-4 has only been out for 16 days now, and more than 15 different political tests were done, and it was more or less the same result. So if you ask it about any kind of contentious topic, then it would probably give you the original initial prompt. This is a complex topic. People disagree. There are more than opinions. It's basically the template, the default. But the way that it would present both arguments, or the two sides of that argument, is from a more or less a liberal or a leftist side point of view. So even if it's trying to tell you more or less factual information, but if it's about any social issue or any political issue or any kind of contentious issue, the way that it would present it is already from a political standpoint. So that's where it gets much more contentious.
Yeah, and not just political. I mean, when we talk about the way these models are trained, it's a black box to us. The data that's coming in, we actually don't know where it comes from, and there's a massive amount of it, and there's no way to dig into it. So the ability to debias these models, not just on the political side of things, every single bias that it can have, that's another thing that would be interesting to talk about, because what are kind of some of the implications of learning from a system that has an inherent bias that we don't even know how to like tease it out, and we don't even know it's there. Does anyone have an opinion on this? Sandra?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really important issue. And again, that we shouldn't really use those systems in order to cut corners and save some time, because the systems are built by a certain demographic that is not very inclusive. The systems are trained by a demographic that is not particularly inclusive. The data that it is trained on is not necessarily demographically inclusive. So if you think about especially literature, the literature that will be recommended, the literature that will be, supported, is the literature very often of Western orientated people, very often middle-aged white men. I apologize for but that's just the case. That means the demographics are completely left out. So the first result, and we already had that with like search results or recommendation, will just perpetrate a certain knowledge. And again, let's talk about what knowledge actually means, what expertise actually means, and what is can actually be removed from socio-demographic or historical experiences, which it can't. So it would just perpetrate and solidify inequalities further up. And if you just use it as fact or don't critically engage with it, there might be a whole wealth of literature from communities that are disenfranchised that we never get to experience. And that means that we just get narrower and narrower, when education should be the opposite. Like a book is never a mirror, it's supposed to be a door. And so you shouldn't just look and see what you already know, what you're already familiar with. It should be a door to a world that you are not familiar with yet. And that's the exact polar opposite that those systems are doing, because they're just feeding you stuff back. That it's
predefining things for you, basically. Yeah,
that's the opposite of that.
Yeah, exactly. I totally agree. Philip?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with Sandra. Just a few points of this, maybe. So one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, what's the alternative? And obviously, there are a lot of bigoted, biased, middle-aged males who are teachers, and including myself, just not the bigoted and biased part, I hope, but there's, of course, this kind of self-illusion about it sometimes. So on the one hand, yes, we have to be super careful, and there are so many pitfalls, particularly when it comes to underrepresentation, and there are also a lot of efforts in the community to broaden this base. But what's certainly not very helpful, and I guess this is maybe not a debate we want to go in too deep, but what's not very helpful is for OpenAI and other developers not to disclose what they trained the data on, how they curated it, how they actually went about checking, using Kenyan workers to do the nasty work, and so on and so forth.
Right.
So that's a pain point, certainly, and the European AI Act, and I guess again that's a different story, but tries to make some steps toward that direction. Second point is monitoring, I think, and I've been discussing this with Sandra before, even relatedly, concerning research. Monitoring obligations, even for non-professional users or for students also, I would tend to think that with respect to some specific criteria, such as non-discrimination, we should all be kind of in the loop, and we should all be under an obligation to actually do our fact-checking, to look at it specifically. And then if we find something, not only to change it and not use it, but also to speak out on social media, or send it to the developers and say, hi, please, this is what I got. See, please correct this. And if you don't do this, then, start a campaign. And so we have to be aware of these biases. But of course, the beauty of these systems at the same time is that somehow you can see it, perhaps to some extent, in the data, and you can try to refine it, whilst it's kind of difficult to change a 60-year-old who's been bigoted all his life.
Right.
So there's, again, ups and downs. And just on the critique point, while this conversation was happening, I was just going on Bing AI and asking for a critique of Richard Posner's approach to law and economics. So if you're a law scholar, you might know that Richard Posner is the most cited legal scholar in history. And he's been very influential in this 20th century in pushing a new type of, approach to the law that's very economics-based, very efficiency-based. And you get some interesting answers, like, some critiques of Richard Posner's approach point out that it's too narrow, fails to take into account important social and political factors, too focused on efficiency, lacks important moral considerations. All of this I would absolutely subscribe to. And then you can dig deeper from there. So even we can try to learn ways of critique by putting this into the system. But I think we have to be careful, like with a calculator. My son is just a first grader, and they're learning how to calculate. They do not use a calculator, of course.
Yeah.
So similarly, I guess we should have lots of classes up front where you learn how to write, how to read, how to critique, how to build arguments without AI, and then we put this on top of it later on for the more refined classes.
I agree. Faisal, I'm going to take your comment, and then I'm going to move to some of our questions coming from the audience.
Yeah. Okay. So my final point, maybe to add to this, is that the biases that from the language models leanings is actually counterintuitively implemented in order not to make it extreme. Everyone maybe remembers Tay's Microsoft Tay, which was like a Twitter account, and people could interact with it. And within 24 hours, it was extremely racist, sexist, xenophobic, and bigoted, and they had to take it down and apologize. So in order for that not to happen again, I guess the designers had to implement a lot of safeguards, a lot of points where it would stop. So the ending result is that it would have a more or less the opinion of a corporation that's trying not to be too offensive to anyone or not to be too critical. So that's where it lands on, basically.
Yeah, so maybe those guardrails might be artificial, or they also are inserting other types of biases just to kind of stay on the safe side. Yeah. So this question from the audience kind of ties into the conversation we're having right now. It's from Lawrence. He says, I have concerns about the decreasing transparency of companies developing these LLMs. The open and OpenAI is becoming misleading And as these models become more powerful, I worry that they and or other AI companies could concentrate control of this immense power in few hands if we do not continue to expect open sourcing and transparency on the technical details of their developments. It's kind of what we were already talking about, but I don't know if anybody has anything to add to this particular comment.
Yeah, I can only agree, I guess, and say, yes, absolutely echo that. There is just an incentive to be closed off. There is an incentive not to be transparent. Keeping data secret, keeping algorithms secret is, something that gives you a competitive advantage. The trade secret laws that we have allow you to do so. And so there will always be a battle between transparency and secrecy. And we just need to find a good balance there. And again, that's a very European type of thinking, I guess, where you try to find like a middle ground between those two things that are always going to be in competition with each other, but neither of which are good. Like full transparency might on the one hand seem as a good idea because why not? But actually too much transparency can also lead to certain harms if it gets in the wrong hands, for example.
Exactly.
In turn doesn't mean that full opacity is the answer, right? So like just because left is bad doesn't mean right is good. And so that binary thinking is just something that's really problematic and just something that I hear so often in that whole ChatGPT, Gen AI thing where they're just two sides on the completely opposite ends of the spectrum screaming at each other when the answer is unfortunately somewhere very like in the middle of both things. So full transparency and full opacity, neither of those are solutions. You really need to find a way of having meaningful transparency, which allows you to have oversight without allowing people to game or manipulate the system or completely ruin the business model.
Right, which actually goes for any type of AI or many technologies. Yeah. Philip, did you have something to add?
Well, yeah, those are all very important points. I just want to say two things. Again, I couldn't agree more, but there's also, I think, a helpful U.S. perspective that we can bring to this because it's these, of course, concerns where we have to navigate the Scylla of full transparency and the Charybdis of full opacity, and somehow find a middle ground is something that we see in many different scenarios. And one particular angle where this plays out is in U.S. pretrial discovery proceedings. So again, there, for people who are not familiar with it, if you want to sue somebody in the U.S., you have a certain right to actually look at the data of that potential defendant so that you can actually bring a case. And of course, if you're a potential claimant, you want to get all the information, you want to get all the transparency. And if you're a defendant, of course, you want to disclose nothing, And what happens is that there are some things in the middle that are being done, such as, courts issue protective orders. They say, well, you can have a look at it, but only insofar as, and protecting trade secrets, so and so. And there is, of course, something that these days is particularly virulent. Special masters get appointed, as we've seen in numerous cases involving former and current US presidents. And so there are ways, I'm just saying, of the legal system that have developed over, centuries to deal with this. This is not a particularly new phenomenon that's new to AI. It's just that, of course, somehow technically, sometimes it's a little more difficult than with, the old style, if you're just 30 whatever boxes to take out somewhere. But that's one thing. I think we have instruments that can deal with it. And the second point is that we need to consider, and because the second point that was raised was concentration, right? Concentration in the hands of few. And I think that's a major concern as well. Elon Musk, with his very controversial and I think absolutely nonsensical letter that he posted, when was it, day before yesterday? I guess just wanted to catch up and also wanted to say, hey, OpenAI, you hold on, you give me a break for half a year. I also want to be part of this. I want to catch up. But we should not forget that there are lots of startups doing this also. And for them, sometimes they can have a very hard time, actually preparing all these documents that, for example, the AI Act foresees. And I'm talking to a lot of these people in the startup scene. And we have to make sure that regulation, that compliance, let's say, is feasible for large and small enterprises. Because if we just order compliance, oversight, and everything all the same for everyone, Google's just going to take 10 million. They're going to give 5 million to the lawyers and 5 million to the the technicians and the computer scientists, and that they're going to deal with it. Whilst if you're a startup who just collected 13 million, you cannot do that. So those are some angles that we have to consider, I guess, along the line. But all in all, I couldn't agree more with the comment.
Yeah, that's been a heated debate in Europe for sure. What the kind of power dynamics between the larger companies developing AI versus the smaller ones, and the fines actually for walking into something like a non-compliance for a startup would basically eliminate them from the market. So it's definitely not, it's not matched. I want to switch gears a little bit. I'd like to take it back to the students, and obviously we can continue to chat about some of these other issues because they're very there's a lot to talk about. So I have a question from the audience that says, on the requirement for critical thinking with ChatGPT, what are the practical implications for education? How do we ensure that students have the skills and understanding to use the outputs appropriately? So I want to put that back to the students in terms of, do you feel that you have the skills and understanding to use these tools appropriately and to be able to either trust or build upon the outputs that the systems are giving you? Maybe Moiteri, you could expand on this one.
All right. I personally feel like I have the skills and understanding, but what is important to note is that these skills and understanding come from the initial type of education, how we previously learned, how we're told not to trust sources. For example, when we were searching on Google, we were told not to trust Wikipedia. These kinds of skills that we learned before the AI came about are the kinds of skills that I now implore over using AI, knowing that nothing on the internet can ever be trusted.
Right.
Critical thinking, I have a very pessimistic view about this because I think with the development of AI, critical thinking will eventually diminish because there'll be no need to think anymore, because there'll be a program that thinks for you, that does everything for you. Where any question you have, it answers. And I think this poses a threat to the way that we think. However, I think with the development of technology, eventually there'll be a new way in which things are done. Even if the traditional way of thinking about things will be diminished, a new way will always develop such that it will surpass or be better than how we used to do things. Right. So it brings a lot of changes, and it has a lot of potential, as much as it has that very similar potential to destroy a lot of things that had been pre-established.
Right. Jason?
Yeah, the one thing I would add that I think is a useful lens to frame this discussion is whether the skills we're talking about are more like calculators, where you want to develop those skills and then augment your abilities with a calculator, or more like say in the past when we used to memorize, when like my parents' generation used to memorize periodic tables, whether the skills are like that, right? So like I want to make very clear the distinction between skills that are like calculators and skills that are like memorizing the periodic table. Like one is extremely like one is still useful, right? Calculators are like mandated now in some maths examinations because they're more reflective of what real world application looks like. And that type of skill is still important, right? So this is why Philip's child can still like develop these mathematical skills independent of the calculator and then start using it. But there is another class of skills, I would say. Like there's this other class of like understanding that is genuinely not needed anymore, right? Like it doesn't matter whether I know how many like atoms helium has, or like whether yeah, exactly. And I think there are like that should be the way that we frame a number of these skills that we used to hold dear, right? Like Moiteri mentioned that there are a number of skills that are going to be destroyed or that are going to be made obsolete. And I think the way that I would want to frame this is like, how do we put these into these two categories, right? Are these things we still want to develop amongst the children or like among students because we still think this is essential to functioning society? Or is this really going the way of memorizing a periodic table?
Okay, Julia?
Another perspective I'd like to bring is the fact that with every new development of technologies, the same discussion is held. So for me, for example, I love to sew. Some people might have said the invention of the sewing machine would destroy the art of hand sewing. But if you make the choice to learn that skill, you can still do so. So it's important to really bring us back down to earth, I think, and not maybe fearmonger a bit. It's a choice to let a skill be destroyed. For example, handwriting as well. I love calligraphy, and that's not a practiced art anymore, I don't think. At least in school, I had to learn how to use cursive, but it wasn't destroyed by artificial intelligence or technology. It was just destroyed because people thought it was useless. So perhaps instead of fearing the technology itself, we can think of what is really important for children to learn. And like Professor Hacker and Moiteri brought up earlier, was that we still teach kids how to do these skills without the help of technology. So as long as we have that foundation, we can build upon it without this kind of fear. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. Following up on that, I have another question/comment from Bertram. He says, we learned to write with a pen, but we often did not get taught how to write with a keyboard. Now that we have a tool where we need to think critically, but how do we make sure that the average, not just the interested one, is learning to use it in the way that it's intended? So it's kind of the same conversation, right? Like, do we have the ability to have even the critical thinking to understand whether or not we're using these tools properly, and if the outputs that they're giving us are to be trusted, once again, with the same issue. Any other comments on this? Yes, Sandra.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really, really good question. How can we make sure that we don't leave anybody behind, which is essentially the question. And so I think two things are really important here. And again, coming from two sides, I think there's a very dangerous, toxic narrative to say this is useful education, this is unuseful education. If I reflect back on my education, I studied everything that there is on God's wide earth. I studied philosophy, I studied psychology, I studied economics, I studied medicine, I studied everything. And I can say, now that I'm, a law professor here, that I still draw on a lot of the stuff that I've learned that wasn't immediately directly useful for the things that I'm doing right now, right? I studied philosophy, for example, and it helped me immensely. I studied economics, that helps me now immensely as well. I did study a little bit of politics, which is very helpful now too, but that wasn't anything that was offered in a classical law setting. So this premature notion of this is not useful anymore and you will never use it is really, really toxic, because very often creativity comes from understanding the big picture questions and drawing different perspective. History, another example. I studied history and I studied art history, for example. And I use it in my daily life now, and immediately it wasn't useful for the things that I was studying. So let's not say that education is only useful if it's immediately fitting with the job profile that you're aiming for. Yet, on the other hand, I think it's very important to keep an eye on what you're going to do later in your life. And again, in a situation where many folks will not have one job for the rest of your life, right? That's I think something from past generation where you have a job at the age of 18 and you have it until you retire. Just because automation is moving around so much, it might have to be that you have to reskill. And so having a balanced middle ground where you prepare students with a future eye of the changing markets and change of job prospects, and having an education that is useful or practically applicable is important, but not being dismissive of the wealth of education that might not immediately sell in that realm. So being a well-rounded critical thinking person is something that we have to really treasure and will pay off. That's a return on investment, in my opinion.
Absolutely. And I think if you position it that way, with this kind of black and white thinking, you actually are missing out on things that you don't know in the future, whether they'll be beneficial to you. Some of the things that you were talking about, politics. Okay, maybe you weren't thinking that was something that was going to be super crucial to your career, or maybe it wasn't super crucial, but it's adding something that's extra that would have been excluded had we used this criteria of that's useful, that's not useful, memorizing is not useful, these types of, So Julia, you had an opinion?
I do. To bounce off of you, I think I'm going to bring the Americans' perspective in a bit, where our education is very expensive. So pursuing all of those different topics is just unfeasible for so many people. I mean, it costs tens of thousands of dollars for a college education. And so people are foregoing now college. And when a discussion is, well, what should we learn in school? And a lot of people would say that they want really vocational skills rather than philosophical classes, legal, or like a critical thinking, I think, based classes.
Mm-hmm.
So how would you convince someone then that all of those other things are actually useful if we can't afford to pursue it?
Yeah, I think it's also the fact that you bring up the American perspective. I think that is something that is unique about U.S. education system. Like, for instance, like I live in Europe and I hear about, you know, the European education system, like high school and middle school and things like that, learning things that we definitely didn't learn. So learning about the classics, learning about Latin, learning about all these different things. And that is not a reality in American society. So there's definitely a cultural difference that should be taken into consideration when we're talking about these things. Sandra?
Yeah, just to follow up on that, and like Philip knows that as well, because we talked about this previous as well, but like in Europe, in many countries, and like the countries that I'm native to, which is Germany and Austria, education is basically for free.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a human basic right, and it should be for free. I think everybody should have access to free education, and it should not be a luxury, and it should not be something that is for sale. But again, this is like a cultural perspective where I think we should actually have a conversation around that, right? Because like this is not a fact based in law, that's an ideology, right? And so thinking about like the implications of that is really very important. I was lucky enough, I didn't have to pay for my university education because nobody had to, because that's just something that is seen as a human right in itself. And so it might be just interesting to play around with like the value of education, what it means for a society, and have a cultural discourse on that level. I would find that very interesting.
Right.
Yeah, like maybe the thing I would add is like I would ask Sandra and Julia, like given that I agree, I think there is this dominant narrative of useful education and unuseful education, right? But my question to you would be, if we don't use this framing, right? Because this was the framing from which like education initially emerged to build like human capital and to build human knowledge. And even though, like, for example, Sandra, you mentioned that those wide variety of subjects, they were ultimately useful in your career. Like, my question to you would be, if this is not the way that we decide what topics should be studied, what is, right? Like, how are we selecting from the vast like forest of human knowledge what are the essential skills, right? And how is this undermined by like the availability of technology that we are now seeing today?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think we would need to do a lot of work. And I think a lot of the things that I'm thinking about in terms of like policy perspectives always start at the educational level, because I think that's really where you need to start. I think there's like a lot of like things that could be done where you create a more engaging, more inclusive, maybe unorthodox curriculum where you do teach people the things that they need to know. I wouldn't want to take away from like, let's say, you know, you want to educate somebody who's a doctor. I wouldn't say, oh, let's not focus on the left side of the body anymore and do like classics instead. Like, that's not what I'm saying. But it might be a way of giving a full education for the things that you need to know and topping that up with different types of perspective, which is not just an add-on where you have an ethics class because you're doing, you know, a CS on the side. It's more about thinking about that creativity, human ability, innovation, doing something groundbreaking has never started based on something that was already there. It's always about bringing together different views and perspectives in a way that hasn't been done before. So if you are only offered a very narrow way of thinking, you will never gonna be the one that breaks the path. So even if I can't sell you on the thing that knowledge and education should be just something that's enjoyed for the sake of it, if you want to do the best of it at something, it's more likely that you're going to succeed if you're able to draw on different types of sources and come up with something that is for your original. And that type of embracement is just something that needs to be fostered. And I think at the moment we are starting to narrow down and only focus on the things that immediately gets you hired once you graduate. But if the aspiration is to have like a job that is really fulfilling, the job that is prosperous, a job that makes you want to go to work every day, then we have to think about education in a different way as well.
So more questions. We have lots of questions from the audience. Anyone can take these questions, or actually this is a comment kind of to open up maybe a provocative statement. The LLMs tend to reinforce a particular disciplinary canon. So for example, in philosophy, they're showing it only refers to European male philosophers and not other philosophers. People new to philosophy or junior students would not know the difference. So this goes back to what I was asking Moiteri, for instance, like, do you feel that you are, enabled, or you have the ability to kind of interact with something that is probably going to be inherently biased? And what she came back was actually, as someone who's grown up with the internet, she knows that she has, to be skeptical of these types of things. Would anybody like to comment on this topic? Yes, Philip?
Yeah, so in fact, I happen to also study a bit of philosophy, and I took a philosophy class on, what was this? Philosophy, of course, back in old Greek philosophy. So this reminds me, by the way, a lot of the Platonist critique of writing. Plato obviously was of the had the impression that writing itself would destroy civilization and the knowledge and everything as we have since, and that's why he didn't write up any of his Socrates of his writings. So the problem was, but what I wanted to say is that what we had in our new, it was 15th century to 17th century class, it was all male white philosophers. And why? Because I mean, those are the ones that primarily were allowed to write and think at that time. And I'm sure there were lots of women who were just underappreciated, but that was long before ChatGPT. And so I'm just saying it's all a matter of perspective and alternatives. And I think the current alternatives are not necessarily better. Well, so let's try to use these models to actually ask for something else. Actually, when I was just doing this exercise with law and economics, critique of Posner law and economics, it suggested what other types of economics would you want to look into, and one of it was feminist economics. It was one out of a number, but I could have picked that one, And so that's a general topic, and let's try to use this technology and make it better for bringing in a lot more voices from all spectrums. Just one minor comment, maybe, or two minor comments on what was discussed before. I think this is going to change really the curricula across the board. My sister is a medical doctor, and I don't think, and when she studied medicine, this was not on the table. I think it's not going to be possible to study medicine now without having an in-depth class about how to interpret an ML annotated radiology or whatever skin cancer assessment. Absolutely makes sense, and it's crucial to teach these persons how this works, what the opportunities are, and what the limitations particularly are. So that's one thing. And the second thing is democratization. I mean, particularly if you come from, regions where either education is super costly if it has to be good, US, or it's just generally very difficult to get good education, large parts of the world, then this is a tool that's universally accessible as long as you have internet. And as long as the basic models are good enough, those that you don't have to pay for. That's certainly a trend that we're going to be seeing, that we're already seeing now. You have to pay for the better models, but as long as the free models are decent, that's actually a boon in many regions where the alternative is just so much worse. And so that's something I just want to highlight as well. Again, of course, with the petitum of, the desideratum of bringing in all these different voices.
Excellent points, Philip. Faisal?
Yeah, I can also parallel philosophy, especially like the Western philosophy tradition, with music, for example. I'm not a musician, but I do have two brothers who are and many friends who are. So if you just Google or you go to any music school and you want to study music theory or this theory of music, what you're going to learn is basically the Western canon of music theory, which is very limited if you want to interpret the entire theory of music around the world, because every country and every region has its own individual way to interpret that theory. So it's more or less what has become the standard. Like even if you were to go to philosophy, people often go way back up until the Greeks, which are arguably not white, but they're still, that's what dictated the European canon of philosophy. But philosophy goes even much more before that. Some of the earliest human rights canons that came on this planet were from Persia hundreds of years before the earliest Greek philosophers. So it's just, that's the simple view, that's the limited view, more or less, of how to interpret the world. And we were just talking about thinking critically and how to be able to understand the world around you through whatever means of knowledge that you have, necessary knowledge, useful knowledge, but also knowledge from maybe other parts of the planet, which constitute the vast majority of people living on this planet. If you take India and China alone with Eastern philosophies, it's more than half the population. So you might want to take their perspective into question.
Can I just add something quickly?
Sure.
I was thinking about this, right? Like, what about education that makes this philosophy question or this music question one that is so pertinent and so resonant? And I think the answer to this is because education has this additional purpose of exposing unknown unknowns, right? So as the person who was asking the question mentioned, right? Like, we don't know that we don't know. Like, experts, like novices in a field don't know that they don't know this huge vast sums of knowledge, right? And in a similar way, like those who are studying music theory for the first time, they don't know that they haven't engaged with this. And from an educational perspective, like if the music theory is the only thing that's being taught from a Western canon, this is the only thing that is going to be available. And I think this like speaks more to the normative role of education, specifically like you want education to expose you to the unknown unknowns, right? This is why I'm at school. Like, this is why I study subjects that I like on surface don't think I will enjoy, because like I don't know that I will I don't even know whether I will enjoy them or not. And I think it is like this role that like I would bring back the discussion to the role of AI, and I would say that in this capacity, in this ability to show us what we don't know, I'm actually a bit hopeful as to the approach that these large language models have taken in really trying to give this balanced view. Yes, we can mock the balanced view, right? Yes, we can say, look, this is like a politically correct thing coming from a company that is trying to say, like, trying to cover all of their bases. But I think that is legitimate. I think that is the way that this type of technology should work. It should be trying to expose us to these things, these perspectives we didn't know. And I understand the concerns of the question about like Western philosophy and like how this is overrepresented, and I would echo like what Philip has said about like the actual corpus of data that is being trained on, right? Like, obviously the availability of that type of philosophy to OpenAI is like a lot more, but I would say that like I would actually like be pretty optimistic about these large language models and their ability to, for example, if you ask it about the theory of mind, to present these different opinions on what on the views of different perspectives. And I think it is like the skill that should be taught here, right? Like the like calculator type thing is, how do you prompt these models to access the latent knowledge that they have rather than dismiss their views outright?
Great, thank you for that. So more questions from the audience. Camila is asking, in line with what Julia mentioned, it's important to consider ChatGPT creates narratives or hallucinates to fill in the gaps, which is dangerous if the reader of the ChatGPT text is not used to fact-checking online data, especially considering children. Could the popularity of ChatGPT rush schools around the world to include online fact-checking activities into the curricula? Any opinions there? Jason?
Yeah, so the thing I would say about online fact checking, and it's like the way that I frame it is like you're sort of like kicking the can down the road, right? Like so there's this one like frame, which is like, obviously we have to be able to have done this fact checking on the internet already, and now we have this additional layer on top of it, right? We not only have to fact check the information that the model is drawing on, but we actually have to check the model is like drawing on it itself. So like in short, I think like this type of fact checking is like, I would not only frame it as online fact checking, but like specifically how this type of critical thinking needs to be taught. not, right? This is a necessity for anyone who goes into research, but also increasingly anyone who needs to just find information in their day-to-day lives. But I think also the onus is not only on the students themselves. I think that we will eventually see that these companies are starting to introduce changes that will make it such that these sources are easily trackable. And Philip was mentioning Bing Chat earlier, like we can see this sort of innovation that is happening already from the first models that were available. And I suspect, like me personally, believe that in the future, this will be much less of a problem, because in a similar way that humans now can be trained to do a lot of this critical thinking work, I think models can be trained as well. And I think we're at this like transition period where we're seeing like a lot of the hallucination that I suspect will eventually go away. Yeah.
My opinion on that one, if I can add it, is that online information is highly dynamic. So it's really hard to be able to say that a model is going to be able to solve those problems. And then I would also wonder, what model, drift, what we're looking at in terms of drift in models, because since this is behind closed doors, owned and centralized by one single company, how do we know really if they're taking care of, updating these models for this particular purpose? So I'm a little bit skeptical of that, but I'm glad that you're optimistic. So go ahead. Did you have something you want to say about that?
Yeah, the slight thing that I would like add to this transparency discussion is that, yes, I think transparency is important. Yes, I believe that this is something we should desire. And like there are specific amounts of information that I want. And yes, I agree it's on a spectrum. We don't want to go too far in either direction. But I would say that in regards to your concern about whether we can see this progress happening, like we don't need to be able to see inside this black box to understand whether these models are getting better at according to reality. And I think as far as I know, like the direction of progress seems to be going in the correct direction. And so that's probably where I just draw my source of optimism, that it is, in fact, as we see these models develop, they're hallucinating less. As we see these models develop, they're able to like give their references, they're able to give their sources. And I suspect, like, given the current rate of progress, this ultimately would be a temporary problem.
Okay. Anybody else want to add anything, Moiteri? Do you have anything to say about this particular topic? Or Faisal, or anybody? Go ahead. No, Moiteri, go ahead. You unmuted.
All right. So the idea about online fact checking. First of all, we have an AI model, and we're supposed to fact check whether the AI model provides correct information. And this fact checking, as according to what we do here, is we fact check through the internet itself. It's like fact checking with a fact checker itself. Basically, what I'm saying is this is the paradox: a wheel of similar information where we're trying to fact check with what's already out there, and we're trying to find something different. Then this now eludes the idea of what is true and what is not.
Exactly.
And I think something that the world has always struggled with. What is real, what is true, and what is not? And what's on the internet is so vast. There's so many things on the internet that so many sources could relay the same story in so many different ways. So I think it would be a huge challenge in fact checking, although there's a possibility that another model could be developed that is intended specifically to fact check. But still, there are a lot of flaws in terms of what is fact and what is not fact.
No, of course. I mean, a model could be drawing from a knowledge base, but the knowledge base itself could be biased, or the knowledge base itself could be wrong. So yeah, and that, to me, the transparency aspect is really important, because you can't really do these things without understanding what's happening behind closed doors. But it's kind of always we get in a loop about this. Julia.
What I was going to bring up was this idea of rushing schools to prepare students to fact check. I don't really think that there's going to be a rush necessarily, but there's just going to be more of an emphasis on teaching children how to fact check and navigate the internet. I think that's not a bad thing, to be honest. I think the more and more we use the internet and algorithms and AI in our life, the more we have to prepare our children to deal with them. That's all I had to say there.
Okay, Faisal?
Yeah. I want to chime in on Jason's point. And I'm sorry to say that I don't necessarily share your optimism. I'm usually the cynical person in the room. So especially like when it comes to ChatGPT, one of my favorite interactions was like last month. So I asked for a prompt about a set of information. Then I asked it, do you have like any academic literature that would support that? So like it gave me like a full academic article with the name of the author, the name of the article. It even gave me like the link, which is Sage, and then the DOI. So I Googled it and I couldn't find it. Like, okay, then I'll just look for the author, and I couldn't find the author. I looked for the paper and I couldn't find the paper. And the website was like 404 not found. So it actually made all of that stuff up.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's not just about like accuracy, it's about literally blatantly making stuff up. And it doesn't just stop there on the like terms of being hopeful that it'll get better and accurate. Of course it will, to make a better product, to make it more profitable. But on the ethical front and how good it's going to be, Microsoft recently laid off their entire AI ethics team. The team that's responsible for GPT-4 published a paper 2 days ago, that Sparks of Artificial General Intelligence, where in a bunch of lines, they actually mentioned the management from Microsoft is rushing to just release the newest editions of GPT, no matter how flawed they are, no matter how problematic they are. So I'm sorry, I don't necessarily think that these companies, amidst an AI war, what they're calling it right now, and every single company is competing to be the dominant one. So I don't think they necessarily have the interests, the best interests of people in mind.
Which, getting back to Philip's point, maybe the only way to counterbalance that is to speak out, right? That's what you were saying before, Philip, that if you see things that are really not working, that are really unfair, but yeah, there's definitely there's a lot of power in large companies controlling these types of technologies. Philip, you had something to say?
Oh yeah, just on this point, I think that's also where regulation potentially needs to step in. So what we've seen in the Digital Services Act, which is the EU instrument for countering misinformation and hate speech, is that they have a mechanism that's called the notice and action mechanism. So basically, if you're Twitter, if you're Facebook, and users tell you, hey, that's a post, that's not supposed to be there, swastika or something, which is forbidden in Germany, for example, so you can't have it on Facebook Germany, then they have to go after this, and they have to check it, and they have to correct the post, they have to delete it. And that's well known from copyright law as well. You probably all know in YouTube, that's disabled if it's a movie, if you post a James Bond movie and that has been, where the copyright hasn't been cleared. And I think we need a similar mechanism for generative AI models, in fact, where users are able to say, hey, look, I gave this prompt and it turned out this racist or this whatever bigoted or this just plain wrong and misleading answer. Please take care of it, OpenAI. But if we just leave it at that, OpenAI is likely to say, well, for some we take it up, for others not. This is just too much to do. So we need a mechanism. We need to compel them to put a mechanism in place. So that's one thing. And another thing that the DSA has is trusted flaggers, which I think is also a good model, where entities like NGOs, they can actually register with local authorities, with national authorities, and then they are kind of decentralized watchdogs, official watchdogs. And if they send something in and they say, here's a problem, then the companies have to take care of it within a day or two. So it has to be prioritized. So that's also kind of nice. And so those are things that are just coming to my mind, where I think we need a lot more that's happening here, because one thing that we haven't really talked about so much, but that's very much on people's minds, is, of course, the mass generation, the automated mass generation of fake news and hate speech online.
Yes.
And that's a major topic that Sandra has been very vocal about as well. And yeah, I see her hand up. I just want to say that with transparency, there is a small company in Germany, it's called Aleph Alpha, and they are actually, they're running a language model themselves. It's pretty good. It's called Luminous, and they have a new version, AppMan, and they're precisely trying to do this, connecting with a knowledge base, and then actually trying to show where these, where this output comes from. And I think this kind of XAI thing, this is exactly where we need to be headed on the technical level. And then just final point on the discussion about what we should do in class. I think, like we have, methodology classes for many subjects, we now need methodology to include critical thinking and interaction with AI models. And what we did, for example, first thing when I heard about, ChatGPT making these advances, I drafted a policy We have one in place now, an AI policy at ENS. I'd be curious, Oxford, do you already have one, Sarah? Sandra? I think that's something that's crucial, to tell students how to do this, how to actually fact check, how to cite to this. And the last sentence that I wrote in this policy is under the headline of general distrust vis-a-vis AI-generated content. In general, it reads, treat AI-generated text like a very unreliable online source, which exceptionally may be used for your exam. Don't trust anything the AI says. And I think if that's the main message we bring across, I think we've already learned quite a bit.
Exactly. Sandra?
Yeah, Philip already made the segue for the fake news and misinformation point that I wanted to make. And again, fully agree with everything that Philip said already. But just to bring it in further, because I also see, as Philip said, that there is a big issue with misinformation and disinformation that can lead in that. And so and I agree that there needs to be regulation in this place. I don't think the market will not regulate itself on this one, unfortunately. And so there needs to be just a mechanism. We have to think about creatively how to do that. There are certain types of information that's probably easier to catch when it's like very clear cut, this is a problem issue, like,
Right.
saying things about, the Holocaust in Germany or in Austria is really clear. That's illegal. But with other things that we talked about, like, where it's not about facts, and again, facts is like a capital F, like what's a fact to begin with? Might be my birth date is a fact, there's some ground truth, but more often than not, then facts are more like opinions on certain things. And so, what's harmful content, what's hateful content, what's wrong content, that's all open to discussion, where humans would never really agree on anything. And so how can we expect an algorithm or like a notice and take down search algorithm to do that for us, right? And so when it's not clear cut, and 9 out of 10 times it will not be clear cut, there's actually a challenge to make sure that the right content is left up and the right content is being taken down. And again, the responsibility, who should have that responsibility? And again, we had this discussion with the right to be forgotten in Europe, where a lot of people rightly said, should Google be the one that decides what's in the public interest, what's true, what's excessive information, what's information that should be taken down, or should it be somebody else? So like that, again, has just like a host of problems, familiar and new ones, that we have to just critically engage with, because what we really want to do is protect two things at the same time, like the free access to information, which is also related in free speech, but at the same time make sure that we protect people from harmful and hateful and potentially wrong and harmful content as well. So finding, again, that boring middle ground.
Yeah, no, and I think that that's a really good analogy with the right to be forgotten. I think the challenge here is the massive amount of text that's going to be generated is not comparable to what used to be, our body of, or the volume of what we have on the internet. So if every day there are, AI-powered disinformation campaigns or misinformation campaigns producing massive amounts of content, the detection challenge is immense. And like you said, who does that actually lie with in terms of being able to detect and take these things down, and who decides what gets taken down is really complicated. Okay.
Yeah, knowledge also moves through for time and space. If you want to that way, like Galileo Galilei potentially was also somebody who was spreading fake news at a certain point in time.
Yeah, exactly. That was what I meant. That's what I meant earlier about information being really dynamic too, because something that was true yesterday may not be true anymore. Exactly. So it's extremely complex on a technical level. So getting back to the classroom, we have a question that may or may not be from a teacher or professor. Donatella says, I agree with what is being said, but I'd like to know more about online systems to detect ChatGPT writing. I tried some and they did not recognize what I wrote using ChatGPT as AI. Is this a concern?
Could I maybe chime in here as someone who is engaged a lot with these systems and detection? I think I think my personal opinion is that I think these systems have a deadline. Like, I think ultimately these systems will the false positive rate will be too high. Ultimately AI detection as it currently is pretty flawed, right? It can't detect a lot of AI writing. It can detect some of the most blatant versions of AI writing well, but these systems are extremely easy to circumvent, right? Both me and like my friends who are like much less technically minded can do this like fairly trivially following guides on the internet. And I think in the future, it is like, let's actually like conceptualize what these systems are doing. These systems are trying to match up token prediction, frequency of words, essentially, right? And it turns out that like ChatGPT write with a slightly different style. I think eventually, like this is just a technical error, like a technical error or a technical thing, a technical feature, or no, I wouldn't say feature, but quirk about the system that will eventually be fixed. And therefore, like it will genuinely be impossible to detect AI writing because it will be indistinguishable from humans. And I think I would just frame the AI detection debate as like one that is like currently the AI detection has a good chance because of the limited capacity of the models. But I think in the future, right, like this is something we will discuss much less. We will just have to accept the fact that a lot of this writing will not be detectable.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to chat about this? Faisal?
Yeah, I think this is kind of arguable, and in a sense that what they use is it just like matching words and like words frequency, and this is something that AI would write or not. This might be downplaying how complex the detection systems are or might be in the future. They can be incredibly complex in what they do. But I think in also the other way to circumvent what ChatGPT, is it AI generated or not, it's in a sense what you do when you're writing. So if you're using ChatGPT as a draft, but you want to write it in your own style, is this considered, at least from like a classroom test or seminar paper perspective, is this considered you like using ChatGPT to write your paper, or is it just like a ghostwriter or writing a draft for you just to give you a few ideas so you can do your own work, give it your own style? And this has been my personal biggest problem with ChatGPT, is that whatever prompt it gives me, it just seems so disingenuous that this isn't me. I wouldn't write like this. So I always have to rewrite it in my own style just to be able to like give it my own, let's say, touch.
Moiteri or Julia, did you have something about this topic?
Sure. I think it's interesting because in one of my classes, we did have to generate different answers from ChatGPT, and my team was tasked with determining which answers were written by humans and which answers were written by ChatGPT. It was actually quite difficult because I found that ChatGPT writes in the same way native English speakers are taught to write, very direct. So the more like Jason was saying, the more ChatGPT improves, the more difficult it's going to become to detect.
Yes, which is actually getting back to Sandra's point. That is one of the main issues in terms of being able to detect things like disinformation or misinformation, because these campaigns before were launched by humans who wrote in a certain way, and now everything's kind of homogenized, so it all looks pretty much the same. Sandra?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's just going to be a cat and mouse game until the end of time. I like to compare it to cybersecurity, right? You're never going to have a perfect system that will never be penetrated. It will be hacked at some point. It's just a question of time, and it's a matter of preparation. If the system fails, that you have a contingency plan in place, which again doesn't mean that you shouldn't protect. Like cybersecurity issues are not like flawed in that way. It's just like you need to know it's coming at some point. And the same is with detection tools here, right? You can argue, and I have been of the opinion, I know Philip has as well, that you should have an obligation to watermark the outputs of ChatGPT to make it easily understandable that was created. But of course, a tech-savvy person will be at some point be able to remove that watermark if they wanted to. That doesn't mean that the watermark is a bad idea, but it just means at some point the person will be good enough, tech-savvy enough to remove it, right? And then you will have this whole sort of detection tools that can detect it, but it will just be like an arms race going back and forth as it is with cybersecurity. Again, that doesn't mean that the battle is lost. It just means it's a battle that can be won. So, but you can keep the dangers at bay, if you will, and it's something that's still worth doing. It's just, we have to divorce ourselves from the illusion that we're ever going to be mastering that thing, because if you just look back, again, coming back to my education in history, there has never been a time in history where everybody agreed on what the truth actually is, right? Like lying and forging and misinformation and propaganda is as old as coming back to ancient Greece, has already happened there. So it's nothing new in that sense, which doesn't mean we shouldn't fight it. It just means that we have to be realistic about the life cycle of a detection method going forward.
Yeah, and incredibly vigilant about what we're looking at and what we believe. Moiteri?
So about the difference between AI and a human's work, it reminds me of the Turing test, which is about whether an AI system is able to duplicate human intelligence. AI itself has been developed in order to duplicate human intelligence. It goes through all this training, all this information, all that it's fed, so that eventually it can imitate humanity. So I think for AI to reach the ability to imitate or to duplicate what a human would do is the peak of technology. And it's actually a great thing that could be used in various ways. What I'm trying to say is, I think this should be viewed in an optimistic view, that technology can actually reach what humans can reach, or perhaps even surpass it one time.
Yeah, and enable us to do more things. That's something that comes up a lot, right? When our brains are freed up by AI, we can do additional things that maybe we weren't able to do before. Philip?
Yeah, just one thought on the arms race thing, as that comes up a lot. And with Sandra, I agree that we should, at least try to, have something in place that does something like a watermark or whatever. And it doesn't have to be a physical watermark. Oftentimes it could be, a complicated function that says that every X letter that comes out of this function is an E or whatever. So it's not easily detectable. And if you change one word, then that gets screwed up and whatever. So we have to see. I mean, Jason knows more about this probably. So there are many different tools, but an arms race in the end is often a waste of resources. So I guess sooner or later we just have to accept, as people said before, that this is just going to be it. And just like we don't ask now, oh, did you write this essay using Word? Well, yes, of course. So I guess, yeah, we should still strive for codex of honesty, and still in particularly in critical areas, crucial areas, newspaper, social media, and so on, where this has an effect on our democracies, for example, then yes, we should strive to enforce this. And if malicious actors don't abide by it, at least we can punish them later on. But one thing that makes me a little bit optimistic is, and since we're probably at one point drawing to a close, that was something that came to my mind, is kind of nice difference between ChatGPT and GPT-4. There is, in Germany, there are very different regions. So one of is the region of Schleswig-Holstein in the northwest. And my family comes from close to there. And if you ask ChatGPT about the mountain rescue team from Schleswig-Holstein, the Bergwacht, it will give you an elaborate answer on when it was found and how many members it has. Now, it turns out Schleswig-Holstein has a big mountain, which is the Bungsberg. The highest mountain is 160 meters high. So that's in feet, that's, I guess, something like 500, 600 feet. And of course, it doesn't have a mountain rescue team at all. Now, if you ask GPT-4, it tells you, well, it doesn't have one, but it's because it's very flat, and it seems to be that it doesn't really need one. So, right, the models are improving, hallucination is going down somewhat, but it's becoming more subtle also. So we still need to be sort of on the watch out. And I think these questions of how to train young persons and us themselves as educators, on how to critically engage with this is going to be crucial, really, for the future of education, not only, but also for the future of our democratic discourses.
Absolutely. I have a very interesting question that just come in. It's from Ushnish. He's asking, the issue of labor exploitation necessary in developing and maintaining LLMs has not come up. Do universities, teachers, or students have any responsibility in recognizing this issue in their use of LLMs? So this is an ethical AI issue. Sandra?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I wrote it down actually on my notepad to bring it up, and then I forgot. So I'm very, very glad that that topic actually comes up. Yeah, we have to talk about that. We really have to talk about what it means from a labor perspective, from an exploitative perspective, anybody who hasn't read the Time article really should read it, because it's devastating, the working conditions of the folks that have to do that labor. Like, the data doesn't grow on trees. It's not labeled magically. There is a human cost to it. And we need to think about what that means, right? That we're using this magically prepared tool that hinges on the sweat and tears of people who are being exploited. So that's the one thing. The second thing also is not just the human cost and the ethical responsibility, but also the carbon footprint that thing leaves behind, right? Again, it's not a tool that comes in for free. It's something that, the environment pays for as well. And so I think just we need to think, yes, it's an exciting tool. It's a powerful tool. It can do a lot of things, but it's not something that comes for free. It costs something. It has a human cost and it has an environmental cost. And so we really need to think about what we win by using it and what we lose by using it. And I think that's really, really important to critically engage with. And as educators, as well as students, we have to ask those really uncomfortable and important questions.
Absolutely. Faisal?
Yeah, and the exploitation goes much more. And there's one researcher, she's called Kate Crawford. She talks about it and how AI in general might become the next extractive industry of the future, arguably replacing a lot of mining or even fossil fuels. So it doesn't just go onto humans, like basically the actual people who upload or who deal with all the data. It also goes back to all the lithium mines in Bolivia or wherever you get steel from places in Africa. So it's all the parts of exploitation alongside the entire production and value chain that enables you to be able to ask ChatGPT on what's a funny Tinder pickup line, basically, that goes behind this. So right. it goes much, much deeper than that. Yeah.
Right. It should be looked at in terms of the impact that it has on all ethical levels, right? And just thinking about the environmental impact of maintaining these models is incredible, and the value chain, as you're speaking to right now. Another interesting question comes from James. We're already seeing an economic stratification of ChatGPT users with the introduction of paid versus free accounts. In the future, we can imagine more wealthy students and institutions having access to more powerful AI tools. How do we ensure a degree of equality in the availability of these tools for education? Philip.
Yeah, that's a super important point that I've thought about quite a bit as well, because actually my son is in a school where people come from very diverse economic backgrounds. So we live in Berlin in an area where one very poor part of the city, one of the poorest ones, borders right on one of the richest parts. So students come from both areas. And you can already see now that, the resources, the amount of attention people get and the kind of education they get at home are just so vastly different, from partner in a big law firm to a taxi driver somewhere from, with a migration background. So it's really mind-blowing. And of course, this translates into very different equipment people have, at their fingertips at home and in school. And so I think that what we need really is, publicly funded research and publicly funded output. And publicly available output. So if you look at Stable Diffusion, it's the company that's being sued for $1.3 trillion right now for scraping copyrighted material. And I don't want to go into the details of that case, but that model, which is state-of-the-art image generation model, was built by Björn Ommer, who is a fantastic AI professor at University of Munich in Germany. And he built it at his chair, and it's all open source. And, and then they had to take in Amazon for just a bit for the fine tuning because they just couldn't do it on their own technically. And this guy is just a genius, and they have done it in a way so that you can actually have it on your smartphone. They reduce the density of the model to the extent that you can run it on your own computer. And so what we need is precisely this. We need models that can be deployed locally so that you don't depend on an expensive API, but that can be deployed in schools and that are basically funded by, public research. And to the extent that that's not possible, public universities, public schools have to somehow take some money into their own hands and say, hey, whoever doesn't have the possibility to fund this on their own, here we give it to you. And of course, you will never be able to eradicate all these differences. It's the same now. Richer kids have, of course, all these things that other people don't have, particularly when it comes to education. That's a problem everywhere, but we should strive the maximum toward equalizing this.
Wait, Terry?
I think what this question, to address this question, what it comes down to is what are the benefits of paid for or much more expensive AI? If we bounce back on traditional education, we realize that students who have much more expensive education have better opportunities in life. Things generally go better for them. Now, when we look at AI, what are the benefits of having better AI? That having simpler AI could not give those that have it. And if there are to be any further developments or future benefits that are to come along that would make those that have expensive AI have better opportunities in any case, then that will become a problem. As of now, I do not see the difference between having such AI.
Okay. Faisal?
Yeah, and a story similar to Philip's, actually. I don't know if anyone heard about Stanford's alpaca, which is honestly some hopeful stories in this regard, because it was a couple of weeks ago or 3 weeks ago where they developed a large language model, which in my understanding, it more or less piggybacked off other language models. And the entire cost of developing it was $600. And it's actually open source. You can download it on GitHub. And the point is, instead of having gigantic data farms to power these AI, you could probably run it on your phone, on your local machine that might just need access to the internet. So there are ways that there is hope where like let's say the balance can be achieved to like lessen disparity. So we can be a little bit hopeful in that regard, at least. And it comes from an academic institution, so not a company for once.
Yes, quite good one at that. Thank you. Jason.
I might add on to that hope, which is I want people to like think about the counterfactual, right? Like, what is the next best alternative? Like, what does economic stratification look like, right? Like, I go to school in Singapore, and tutoring is like the alternative, right? Like, tutoring is the way that these people with means have been able to get a leg up. And I think like compared to like these tutors who charge like X number of dollars an hour, like to pay like even the additional costs that some of these like the questioner mentioned, like ChatGPT Plus like costs like $20 a month. Like I suspect that if we look at the economics of it, rather than furthering economic stratification, I think it's like one of the best tools we have to combat the stratification that already exists. And I think yeah, I would just, like further add on such that we can look at like the model itself and how there's like very little marginal cost for there to be an additional user of GPT, which makes it like just from first principles a lot cheaper of an option than it is than currently the additional like education enhancement tool. And I know that for example, Khan Academy has come out with this free, like this model that is based off GPT-4 that is like promises to show us like the directions that this could take in leveling the playing field for education rather than exacerbating it.
Thank you. So getting back to teachers in the classroom, another question. I would like to discuss about what we could do to take fear from those teachers who do not know how to handle this tool. So I assume this is alluding to, people who are educators and they're wondering whether or not they're receiving assignments back that are, completely AI generated. Does anyone have an opinion about this? How we can maybe alleviate their fears, empower them? Philip?
Yeah, I guess like offering a hand in terms of, education, reaching out for counseling even, We have for example, at our university, we have put up a group of people who are interested in this, who are exchanging information, but obviously there's a strong selection bias in this. It's mostly people who are already kind of on the way of using it. And it's one of the reasons why I wrote this AI exam policy to, give a guideline to others who feel less secure. And, and I'm not feeling perfectly secure either, because it's all a big experiment at that moment. In trying to give them kind of some guidelines and guardrails for using it. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of institutional tasks that need to happen here, but also a lot of human work, showing people what can be done, what cannot be done, that this is not magic, it's just math. And in the end, we just have to deal with it, because otherwise, not only we as our institutions, but also our students are going to be left behind. If we don't teach them how to use this, they're going to be, if you apply for a job and you can't even handle this, you're going to be out, your material is going to be so much worse, and people are going to ask for this. And as of right now, right?
Yes.
We have to, this is duty of educators to prepare our students for this, if we don't want to, prepare them for unemployment. And so yeah, that's basically that's a long way we have to go with a lot of colleagues from all kinds of disciplines that tend to be very skeptical of this, and sometimes for good reasons. A lot of conversations to be had.
Yeah, I think it probably, like you said, it's math. It starts with demystification. It starts with explaining where all of this comes from, and kind of espousing the benefits, and also identifying many of the pitfalls that we've spoken about here today. Sandra?
Yeah, fully agree. I think that's exactly what we need to do. I think also that just encouraging educators to just engage with the technology themselves is, I think, really, really important. I think thinking about a fear in the abstract is necessarily a good idea. And if you only focus on the bad media that is out there, then you can have the idea that this is like a completely disruptive, not a technology that cannot be controlled anymore. And then you move into sentient robots taking over the world kind of scenario. And so it's really, really important that we don't fall into the trap, even though it's like more interesting, because sci-fi is usually more interesting than real life. The real life problems are already here. So I would really encourage people just to play with the technology in itself, first of all, to get rid of like this mystique around it, right? And then seeing actually how clunky and not super sophisticated it is. And that takes away from the disruptive nature of it, and that it will completely change the life of everybody. I think that's just something that is really, really important, just engaging with the tech itself.
Yeah, that actually, it's a good seg into another comment that we have here. It says, I think it could be quite dangerous to race to AGI as AI or more intelligent than humans without having sufficient constraints on the potential negative effects and impacts of such an AI. Nick Bostrom theorized in Superintelligence that this would be the start of an intelligence explosion where AI could exponentially self-improve and rapidly escape human control. So it's kind of the narrative that you were just speaking to, Sandra, that there is a lot of kind of fear and trepidation around not being able to get our arms around what we've actually created, and it's moving so fast that we can't even catch up to it ourselves.
Yeah, I just think this is, we can have a discussion of whether it's a realistic fear. I don't think it is, but we should really, that discussion of whether that thing is sentient or is super intelligent is sucking out the oxygen out of a room that needs to discuss actual issues like what's the economic impact, what's going to happen to the jobs of the people that are being employed right now, how should we treat the people that are in the value chain and having to label that data, what's about their working condition, what about the carbon footprint that thing leaves behind, what do we do about misinformation, what do we do about bias, like the house is on fire, let's not worry about whether robots should have rights. It's just like a hyperbole thing, but I think it needs to be said. Let's focus on the things that we actually need to care about, and then let like science fiction to the artists.
Okay, good point. Faisal?
Yeah, like straying away from like unjustified technophobia, thinking that it's going to become like Terminator Skynet or the Matrix or whatever, where the AI takes over the world. But when it comes to actually like justified technophobia, like what's going to happen to all the jobs that might be rendered more or less obsolete with this, which in an interesting turn of events, it's actually mostly white collar jobs for once, which will mostly affect people more or less in the West, but it also affects people worldwide. So this is more or less justified. And thinking about all the educators, especially in academic circles, who are too fast to ban it, they're more or less actually probably worried about their livelihoods if they're required or not. And I think these are some of like the most important questions that are happening right now. This isn't in the future. This isn't 100 years or 10 years from now. This is going to starting from today.
Mm-hmm. And interesting that you brought up jobs, white collar jobs, Faisal. I was thinking about creative jobs, right? So if ChatGPT can write poetry, do we need poets? If ChatGPT can write songs, do we need, and not even just ChatGPT, if we go to other sorts of models that are actually creating art, where does that leave us in terms of these disciplines?
Yeah, I think, sorry,
Go ahead, Jason.
maybe I'll just like chime in and say just to zoom out and take the bigger picture here, the logical conclusion of where it does leave these disciplines. And I think it's interesting to note that white collar jobs are going, and the artists like DALL-E 2 or whatever, like seeing these stable diffusion models come and replace the creative job is something I definitely wouldn't have anticipated. But the thing that is interesting to me, or like the thing that I think the logical conclusion of all this discussion on automation and employment is going to go is I'll frame it as like hugs and smiles, or like this is some like straw man, like basically what is ultimately going to be the value of the arts that comes from humans? It is going to be the fact that they come from humans, right? Like ultimately, I think it is going to be the case that you'll have art that is good enough and indistinguishable enough that like it will not necessarily be it will not necessarily be detectable, but I think that is like a place to draw comfort from, right? Like if you realize your inherent human nature is going to be the place where a lot of the value that you provide society comes from, right? Like primary school teachers, like ultimately those jobs won't be replaced because there is something inherently good about the humanness of that job. And I think this is the way that, having spoken to many of the teachers in my school who are a little bit gloomy and saying like in 10 years time, like our role is going to look very different or we won't have one. Like I would say back to them, look, your inherent role as a human is something that is valuable here, right? Like the nature of your profession is going to shift, like the nature of teaching is like, and what it means to deliver knowledge is going to change. But I think there are human aspects of it that will remain the same, and this will remain consistent throughout poetry, through music, through art generation, through like a lot of these white collar jobs where this is somewhat of a hopeful thing, right? Like if we are able to take some of these functions that we used to perform and automate them, this leaves us time, this leaves us agency, this leaves us the fulfillment, like to pursue like what we personally enjoy, like as fulfilled, that what personally fulfills us. And I think this type of conversation is not happening enough in classrooms, right? Like the broad picture, what does this mean for your role in society? Like I am not seeing within the schools that I've talked to or within teachers among adults. And I think this is a thing that needs to change.
Thank you, Jason. Sandra?
Yeah, I also don't like the narrative of like, what if tech is going to be better at something than you? Well, tech should be better at something than you. Otherwise, it would be bad tech. And I don't need it, right? Like every calculator is better at math than I am. Every plane is better at flying than I am. Every submarine is better at diving than I am. That's why I built tech, to do things that I'm not able to do, or to do things better than I do. So this is like just that's what makes good tech good tech. The question is, how do we use that tech, and what's the role that is left for humans in that space? And again, with art, good artists have always used new things to disrupt the status quo and create new art. Coming back to my education in art history, I know I'm drumming this heavily today, but just think about Monet, who used the brushes differently and created a whole new art form, like Impressionism, for example, just by using technology differently. Think Andy Warhol, who used technology to create art, which was also not seen as art at the beginning. Monet wasn't seen as an artist at the beginning. And in the same way, we can think about using those Gen AI models to create new types of art, which will not at the moment be accepted because the status quo of artists is not very embracive to innovation, but that's the history of art, and that has always been the case. So it's really about using technology to do something better that you are not capable of, for example, or augment your own abilities, but not replacing it. But there is a real risk that certain professions will be replaced, right? And we, again, looking at history, if you study history of economics, certain jobs do no longer exist, for example, for better or for worse. And so it's really, really important that we think about what happens to the displacement of those people. Because yes, there's this utopia that, you know, I don't have to mark essays anymore and students have to not write exams anymore. And we're all gonna be, you know, climbing and hiking all day long. But the question is, we get the same salary, right? Then for it, right? Probably not, right? It's not going to be like that. I only have to work 20 hours and get the same salary as if I'm working 40 hours. And so that's the actual discussion that needs to happen. What does a good job look like? How can we make sure that we don't leave any people behind? How we can make sure that they are able to afford a living, and we're not in a situation where you have to have 3 different jobs just to make ends meet. And that's an economic discussion that also needs to happen right now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so just 2 more comments because we do need to wrap up. I mean, we could speak for an additional 3 hours today, I think, with all of you. This is a really fascinating multidimensional conversation. But yeah, I just want to take a comment from Faisal and then from Jason, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I think when it comes to like not just art or more or less any kind of creation, it doesn't have to be that artistic of an endeavor. I think our reactions the first time we saw like a picture from Midjourney or DALL-E, we're like, wow, that's created by AI. And then now you look at it, it's like, huh, okay. It's neat. That's more or less the reaction that most people get nowadays. So one of the problems is that just the sheer amount and like quantity of it actually lessens its value as compared to things that are created by humans. And you can see things like someone saying, oh, you can create your own now TikTok account where you have this AI to text generate, this AI to voice, and this AI for like a person, and then you can create content. And then the easiness of creating all of these, you're going to have such a huge quantity of people making it that it's actually going to make you want to seek out genuine actual people doing this talk. Like, yeah, of course, you can probably use an AI to have like a talk with a panel with students and professors, and every single one of them is AI. And if everyone does that, then you're probably going to try to seek out one where there are actually people talking and speaking their opinions. So there's a point of genuinity and more or less originality, I guess.
Right. Jason?
Yeah, and maybe I would highlight that as, yeah, like being similar. Like there are some professions, there are some roles that have genuine human value. And I think I would just go back to Sandra's point to finish it off and say there is a great irony here. There's like we're standing like at this point in history where we're looking forwards, where a lot of the professions that a lot of us have considered, like me personally, like seem like they won't be a thing in the future. Like someone mentioned radiology, I think it was Philip earlier. We can see already in medical schools, students are specializing less and less in radiology because this essential part of it is being done better by technology. But I would say to the people, like the students and like to my friends, to my teachers, that we're at this point in history where like potentially a lot of future jobs could be replaced. And Sandra is exactly correct. So we have to make sure that this transition point goes correctly. We have to make sure that we, like, the gains from this technology are distributed evenly so that everyone can achieve this sense of agency, this sense of fulfillment. And currently this looks like exploring universal basic income schemes or whatever. But I think what this means for us practically, or like at least what this is mean for my future, is in some paradoxical way, my job is more important, right? Like my job now, like at this like crucial transition stage, is going to be even more important, because it won't only dictate like what my future looks like, but what potentially like the future of the economy and the way that humans function in society looks like. So like this is the way that I've framed the discussion around AI and what this means in education and in our careers, is that, look, this will have an impact on your career, but for now, what it means is you are like, it is your responsibility, our responsibility, to make sure that this goes correct. And so even though in the future, like our jobs might be less important, they are like, they've never been more important than now.
That's an excellent way to close, Jason. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here today. Thank you, Professor Hacker, Professor Wachter, Jason, Julia, Moiteri, and Faisal. Really fascinating conversation. Like I said, there's so much more that we could explore, but I hope we'll be able to in the future. And but for now, we'll have to say goodbye. Thank you to our audience for the great questions, and I hope to see you all on the next episode of AI for Good. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks to the students. This was great. I hope none of you were replaced by an AI. The answers were so excellent. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you for participating in today's AI for Good session. We hope you've learned something new, innovative, and engaging in today's event. We now encourage you to continue the conversation on the live video wall in the neural network. Here you can ask questions, like and comment, share links, complete the poll, connect with interesting profiles, or speak one-on-one using the chat and video function. We invite you to explore the lobby, try the smart matching quiz, visit the virtual exhibits, poster boards, the eShop, and build your personalized AI for Good program. Let's shape the future of AI for Good.
AI is a powerful tool.
This summit can help ensure that artificial intelligence charts a course that benefits humanity and bolsters our shared values.